Alan Brooks thought he had the perfect argument. As a well-known journalist, he had built a career on challenging public figures, forcing them into difficult conversations, and exposing what he saw as weaknesses in their beliefs. But that night, across from him, sat Karoline Leavitt, and she was about to change everything. The stage was set. Bright studio lights illuminated the sleek, modern set of American Perspectives Tonight, a primetime show, famous for its heated political and cultural debates. Millions of viewers were tuned in, anticipating a fiery discussion. Karoline Leavitt, a rising political firebrand, sat confidently in her chair. Her posture was strong, her expression calm. Across from her, Alan Brooks studied her with the sharp gaze of a seasoned journalist, known for his relentless questioning and ability to make even the most composed guests uneasy. The debate was supposed to be about leadership and policy, but everyone knew it would turn into something more. Karoline had built her reputation on standing firm in her beliefs, refusing to back down from difficult conversations. Alan, on the other hand, was known for pushing his guests into uncomfortable corners, exposing what he considered flaws in their arguments. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation followed the usual pattern discussions on economic policies, government regulations, and social issues. Karoline handled his rapid-fire questions with ease, delivering well-prepared and articulate responses. She wasn't just a politician, she was a skilled communicator who knew how to connect with her audience, both in the studio and beyond. Then, Alan shifted in his seat. His eyes narrowed slightly, just enough for a seasoned debater to recognize that he was about to change tactics. The energy in the room shifted. The producers, the cameramen, the audience, everyone could sense it. Something bigger was coming. "Karoline," Alan began, his voice measured, "you often talk about your faith as a guiding principle in your leadership. You've even said that faith has a role in shaping public policy." She nodded, waiting. "But let's be honest," he continued, leaning forward. "Religion, Christianity in particular, is declining in this country. Fewer people than ever believe in a higher power. Science has given us answers that religion never could. And yet, you continue to advocate for faith as if it's some universal truth. Why?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Karoline didn't react immediately. She let the question settle, absorbing the weight of it. Alan wasn't just questioning her personal beliefs, he was challenging the very relevance of faith itself. "I ask this," he went on, "because there are millions of people in this country who see faith as nothing more than an outdated crutch, something that holds people back rather than moves them forward. Do you think that's fair? Or are you just unwilling to admit that faith is losing its place in modern America?" The room felt tighter. People shifted in their seats. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion. Alan had thrown a match into a dry field, and everyone was waiting to see what Karoline would do next. But she didn't rush to answer. Instead, she took a slow breath, tilted her head slightly, and gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. She knew exactly what to say. Alan leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. He was waiting. The audience was waiting. The silence wasn't awkward, it was electric. Finally, she spoke. "You say faith is an outdated crutch," she began, her voice steady. "That holds people back. But let me ask you something, Alan." She tilted her head slightly. "What do people turn to when science doesn't have an answer?" Alan's lips twitched, but he didn't interrupt. "It's easy to dismiss faith when life is comfortable," she continued. "When everything is going well, when your job is secure, your family is healthy, and the world makes sense. But what about when the ground beneath you disappears? When your child is dying in a hospital bed? When you're staring at a casket? When the doctors say there's nothing more they can do? What do you reach for then? Silence. Even the producers, usually whispering behind the cameras, were frozen in place. Alan adjusted his tie, but maintained eye contact. "People turn to faith because they're desperate," he finally said. "That doesn't make it real. That makes it comforting." She nodded as if she had expected that. Response: "Comfort isn't a weakness," she said. "It's human. And faith is more than just comfort. It's resilience. It's hope. It's the belief that even in the darkest moments there is still meaning." You can call that naive, but I'd argue it's the very thing that has kept people from collapsing under the weight of suffering for thousands of years. Alan exhaled through his nose, shifting in his chair. "So, you're saying belief is necessary for survival?" "I'm saying belief is what makes survival worth something." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You're good, Karoline. But let's talk facts." He gestured slightly, as if resetting the conversation. Religious institutions have been responsible for some of the worst atrocities in history: wars, oppression, corruption. And yet, you defend faith as if it's only ever been a force for good. Karoline's expression didn't waver. "I won't deny that people have done terrible things in the name of religion," she said. "But let's be fair, faith has also been the foundation for some of the greatest acts of courage, sacrifice, and kindness. The abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, countless hospitals, schools, and charities started by people who believed their faith called them to help others. You can't erase that just because some have twisted faith for their own agendas." Alan studied her. He didn't have an immediate retort. Karoline took the opportunity to lean in slightly. "But if you really want to know why I believe in faith, why I defend it, it's not because of history. It's not because of politics." She paused. "It's because of a woman I met 12 years ago." Alan frowned slightly. "A woman?" Karoline nodded, her voice softening. "Her name was Margaret, and she taught me something about faith that no debate could ever shake." The audience was silent. Alan's posture tensed. He was listening now, not just preparing his next question. "I met Margaret at a community outreach event. She was 72 years old. She had buried 2 sons, one from cancer, one from a drunk driver. She lost her husband to a stroke. No siblings, no close family left. And yet, she sat across from me smiling, sipping tea, asking how my life was going." Karoline's voice tightened for just a moment. "I asked her how she did it, how she could endure so much loss and still sit there, warm and kind, as if the world hadn't tried to take everything from her." She turned to Alan, no longer as an opponent but as a person simply sharing a truth. "She told me something I'll never forget. She said faith isn't about proof. It's about what keeps you standing when there is no proof." The room was utterly still. "Every morning, Karoline," continued, "she woke up and thanked God. Not because her life had been easy, not because she had been spared suffering, but because she was still here. Because she believed, even after everything, that there was still purpose in the day she had left." Alan opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. The weight of her story hung in the air, and in that moment, the debate was no longer about winning or losing. It was about something deeper, something real. Karoline didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, allowing the weight of the conversation to settle in the room. Finally, Alan cleared his throat and shifted slightly in his seat. "That's a powerful story," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. "But don't you think that's all it is? Just a story?" Margaret found something that worked for her, but that doesn't mean faith is some universal truth. Karoline nodded slightly, as if she had expected that response. "You're right about one thing," she said. "Faith isn't about proving something to other people. It's about what people live through. And if you listen, really listen, you'll hear that same story told in a million different ways. Alan exhaled and rubbed the bridge of his nose. But that's my issue, Karoline. Faith isn't something you can measure. It's based on emotions and personal experiences, things that can't be quantified, and yet people use it to justify decisions that affect everyone. Karoline tilted her head. You mean, like hope? Alan blinked. What? Hope? She repeated. You can't measure it. It's not scientific. You can't prove it exists in any physical way, and yet people have fought wars for it. They've survived the impossible because of it. They hold on to it even when logic tells them they shouldn't. She let that thought settle before continuing. Would you tell someone who just lost their home in a tornado that their hope is just an emotional crutch? That their belief in something better isn't real because you can't put it under a microscope? Alan shifted in his chair again, but he didn't interrupt. That's the thing about faith, Karoline continued. It's not about controlling people or forcing a belief onto anyone. It's about how people make sense of the hardest parts of life. You can call it irrational, but when someone loses everything and still gets up the next day, still finds the strength to keep going, that means something. You can't measure it, but you also can't ignore it. Alan's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. His usual, sharp, confident demeanor softened. He wasn't just debating anymore, he was thinking. The host, sensing the shift in the room, finally spoke up. Alan, do you have a response to that? Alan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced toward the audience, as if searching for a reaction to ground himself. But no one spoke. No one moved. When he finally answered, his voice lacked its usual edge. I think I need to process that. A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't the dramatic rebuttal they had been expecting. It wasn't an explosive takedown or a definitive victory. It was something far more rare, a moment of honesty. But the real impact of that moment wouldn't be felt until later. The debate wrapped up soon after, but the conversation was far from over. The usual applause that followed the closing statements felt hesitant, as if the audience wasn't sure how to react. They weren't walking away with just another political soundbite. They had felt something, and that wasn't easy to shake. Alan gave Karoline a small nod before removing his mic and stepping off the stage. He didn't linger for small talk or post-show commentary. Instead, he walked straight toward the exit, his posture stiff, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Karoline, however, remained seated for a moment longer. She could hear the whispers from the crew, see the way the audience exchanged glances. Some looked moved. Others looked unsettled, but no one looked unaffected. The moment the cameras cut, the first wave hit. Karoline's phone buzzed non-stop messages, missed calls, notifications piling up. Social media had exploded. Clips of the exchange were already circulating. People were dissecting every moment. But what shocked Karoline the most wasn't the reaction from her usual supporters, it was the response from the other side. I don't consider myself religious, but what she said really made me think. I've never heard someone defend faith without attacking the other side. That was different. This wasn't about politics. This was about something bigger. Comment after comment, post after post. People weren't arguing the way they normally did. Sure, there were the usual critics, the expected backlash from those who dismissed the conversation entirely. But something was happening that Karoline hadn't seen in a long time. People weren't just reacting. They were listening. Her team scrambled to respond to media requests. News outlets ran headlines within the hour. Karoline Leavitt leaves journalists speechless, a rare debate. Moment no one saw coming did this conversation just shift the debate on faith in America. Even late-night talk shows, which rarely gave conservative figures a fair shake, covered it not with mockery, but with genuine discussion. And then there was Alan. He remained silent for the rest of the night. No tweets. No interviews. No follow-up commentary. He was usually the first to post a reaction, to control the narrative, but now nothing. Until the next morning, at exactly 8:37 a.m. When he finally broke his silence with a single post, "I've been in journalism for over 30 years. Last night was the first time I walked away from an interview realizing I had more questions than answers." That was it. No grand statements. No damage control. Just honesty. And that was all it took to set off another wave of reactions. But the true impact of that conversation wouldn't be clear for days. As time passed, the discussion only grew. What had started as a simple political debate had transformed into something deeper. It wasn't just about Karoline or Alan anymore. It was about something people had been hesitant to admit for years. They were searching for something more. Podcasters, columnists, and commentators all weighed in. Some called it a defining moment for faith in public discourse. Others called it a wake-up call. But the most surprising reactions came from the most unexpected places. A well-known comedian, famous for ridiculing religion, admitted on his podcast, "Look, I still don't believe in God, but that woman made me wish I did." And that's saying something. A prominent scientist tweeted, "Faith and science don't have to be enemies." Last night, I was reminded why so many still hold on to belief even in the face of uncertainty. And then there were the emails. One stood out, a message from a woman named Rebecca. "I haven't stepped foot in a church in 20 years. I lost my faith a long time ago. But after watching your debate, I sat in my car and cried. Not because I suddenly found God or anything dramatic like that, but because I realized something I missed, believing in something bigger than myself. I didn't even know how much until last night. Thank you for making me think." Karoline read the email twice. Then, a third time. She had spent her career in politics, fighting for policies and debating laws. But this was different. This wasn't about winning an argument or securing votes. It was about a conversation people had been too afraid to have. And if that conversation made even one person think, then maybe it wasn't just a debate. Maybe it was the beginning of something bigger,